Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Paula DuPont, and today we have a variety of topics to talk about, some of them related to Black Lives Matter and the new social injustice sensitivity that we're seeing across the business industry. We're going to talk about how women have been hit a little harder with the unemployment situation right now, and how white-collar jobs actually may be coming back faster than expected. We're also going to talk about how more tech companies, including Apple, which is having its current conference going on right now, are doing conferences online. And we're going to talk about more of reaction to Black Lives Matter and social injustice and what that looks like in terms of a popular video game, and then also more broadly to the fashion industry. And finally, related to that, we're going to talk about the social media platforms and how, although as corporations, they have shown their support for the Black Lives Matter, their followers may not all be doing so. So a lot to uncover today, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. I was reading something recently about how women's job losses in particular will hurt the overall economic recovery of the country. And the article caught my attention both as a woman and also validating what I've seen and heard from many of my friends and others who have been adversely affected by the pandemic and the shutdown. And so when I explored this a little further, unfortunately, it's not great news. And I think that there are other factors that also contribute to why it's a little harder for women to come back into the workforce than for men. And there's always a danger, of course, in generalizing, but for purposes of this article and some of the numbers it cites and some of those contextual issues, I think it makes sense. But, it's hard for anybody to come back, and that is more universal, when you're facing unemployment and trying to get your job back. It's tough. And, male, female, whatever race you are, economic group or type of job, it's rough. But in the case, the story that I'm talking about is showing the relationship between women having a tougher time coming back into the job market as having a real negative effect on economic recovery. Female workers account for the majority of service sector jobs, which may be an insight right there. And that includes food service, personal care. These are areas, of course, that have been more vulnerable to some of the issues of the coronavirus and social distancing. Now, married women who in past recessions took jobs to offset the lost wages when their husbands or male partners were laid off are also likely to seek work because their employment prospects are now limited. These dynamics present an impediment to broader economic growth. If participation among women remains weak, it means fewer workers in a female-dominated field such as nursing or healthcare. Economists say the squeeze on jobs and continued child and elder care responsibilities are also some challenges that female employees are facing, perhaps more so than their male counterparts. This is a difference from previous recessions because goods-producing sectors such as construction and manufacturing, which employ predominantly men, saw greater employment losses. So this is sort of particular to this pandemic that the female-dominated industries have been affected. The shock to female-dominated jobs, combined with the factors of childcare responsibilities, schooling for their children, have also led to a decline in the share of women between 25 and 54 who are working or seeking work. So with them having to be home and take care of children because daycare is not available, not as many have been out as aggressively looking for work, at least according to the experts cited in this article, which, by the way, was in the Wall Street Journal. Dana Peterson, a global economist at Citi Research, says that female job cuts could trigger a decline in global gross domestic product of up to $1 trillion this year, or about a third of the 3.6% year-over-year decline in 2020 global GDP. Another economist has said that this recession likely won't experience the economic benefits of a rise in participation among married women because job losses have been unusually steep in occupations that mainly attract women. Without a boost from female labor force participation, household level inequality may rise as well. So where the roles between, the shared roles perhaps between husbands and wives or among partners could vary as well. The same economist noted a disparity in earnings is already emerging between households in which both spouses can easily work remotely and households that don't have that ability. School and daycare closures because of the pandemic will likely hinder women's ability to re-enter the workforce, at least in the short run. And that, again, was by a projection by the same economist. Married women spend nearly twice as much time as their husbands caring for their children. And that is according to the University of California. There are about 73.5 million children in the U.S. under age 18, and about 70% live with two parents. And that is according to the Census Bureau. So, some of the trends that we've known all our lives seem to be amplified right now in terms of the responsibility of childcare or homeschooling has largely fallen on women. Not universally. We know that's not the case everywhere, but at least more predominantly so than with men. And that's what this particular story bears out. And wish there was more hopeful news on that front. I think what doesn't rise to this level but is still a truth is that although the job sectors that were mentioned here that have been impacted most by the pandemic that are considered female-dominated, they may, yes, be female-dominated, but you have women in many more industries and job sectors than in the past. And while they're not the dominant forces in those job sectors, they still have a bigger place than they have in the past. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those types of jobs in a minute, particularly in how they're coming back, and hopefully this will bear well for women as well.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
About a week ago, I did a special edition of the Business News Podcast called the Jobcast, which focused primarily on the job market and what trends we're seeing, and also some tips on how to land a job and some of the things that you need to do and tools that are available to do that. In any case, the gentleman that I had interviewed for that article runs a talent agency or a recruitment firm, and he has been back officially in the office about a week at the time, but had been working all along during the pandemic because there still were jobs to recruit for. Now, he, of course, has seen a much steeper increase recently and growing continually. He said overall that searches were down about 50%, but they still were there. Firms still needed to hire people, and despite the fact that maybe they couldn't bring people on site to interview them or even offer them an office to come work in, they did everything remotely and continue to do that. And now, of course, as things open up in different states, he, like others, will be able to facilitate more face-to-face meetings and interviews. I saw another story recently about how white-collar jobs may be coming back at a faster rate than otherwise. And, the story drew from a lot of observations from different recruitment firms as well, like the gentleman that I had interviewed. There seems to be a feeling that recently, with a lot of the openings in several states, that there's a broader reawakening in hiring for professional positions. And that is something that, again, the other recruiter, Chuck, actually, I'll just call him by his name. It's easier than saying the other recruiter. But Chuck, who I interviewed for that other podcast, had said the same thing. They're IT jobs. They're professional jobs. And this particular story, it underscores that and says that although more than 1 million new jobless claims continue to be filed each week, certain industries are outpacing others in the rebound. Jobs in technology, healthcare, financial services, and consumer packaged goods are among those that are top areas that are now seeking new employees. Conversely, though, there are not having as many calls for hiring from retailers, apparel makers, airlines, hotels, and academia. And I'm sure that's probably no surprise to you if you've been following the news lately, particularly around retail and airlines and how much they've been hurting in all of this. Maybe less intuitive, or at least at first thought, would be academia, but we're going to talk about that more in a minute. Also, what is happening is that some veteran corporate employees are now finding themselves out of work in those same sectors where they were laid off, furloughed during the time of the pandemic lockdown, and are now finding they have to go out and find a new job at a time when they've already vested maybe 20 or more years in another firm. And that is obviously particularly challenging when you've been out of the job searching mode for that long. It becomes a little tougher to find something. And that is, of course, particularly harder if you're coming from one of the industries that has a tougher time in the rebound, like apparel and retailers. Workers, though, in areas like technology are having a little bit easier of a time because there seems to be more demand and there seems to be more hiring. Employers unexpectedly added 2.5 million jobs in May, which defied expectations. And even though they have declined significantly, new jobless claims remain historically high. So we're still seeing that, unfortunately. So there isn't a balance yet between the new jobs offered and the jobless rates. Still, many of the recruiters who were talked to in this article have said that they've seen more activity in recent weeks since the end of May, with more jobs becoming available, and even, in fact, employers who have been talking to candidates for a while want to close the deal. They want to start getting people in these positions. And it makes sense in a way because a lot of corporations or companies are getting back into gear and need to make up for lost time and lost revenue from the last couple of months. The information technology, marketing, and human resource positions are particularly up, according to this one Chicago staffing company. And one of the recruiters there said it's all been through Zoom or Microsoft Teams when he talked about the interviews, but clients are starting to say, I want to meet face to face. And that's something that they're continuing to see a trend of right now. The one thing that the Chicago firm had noted or observed was that sales positions are down. That typically they'd be interviewing and looking for hundreds of sales positions, and they're just not seeing that. He said, this recruiter said, it's probably just indicative of where the economy is right now. And there just isn't as much to sell, or companies are still figuring out what their market is, if they need to change it, if they need to adjust. So I guess it's a reflection of the time. But another area that I mentioned earlier in this story was the impact to academia. And when you consider right now all the uncertainty for colleges and universities in terms of what they're going to do next fall when students presumably would be back, and some universities are still trying to figure that out, of whether they're going to do a mix of online or in person, if they're going to have in person at all. And, how are they going to run their university? So I don't think there's a clear-cut approach. There's a lot of different ideas, and I guess it depends on the size of the institution and how much is available to do online, that it can be online. Colleges who may be looking to fill positions, they don't know what their finances will be in the fall. They don't know where this is going to shake out. Right now, people are holding on to their deposits. They are not applying at the same rate as they had before. And so there's a lot of uncertainty on that. So overall, I think, while, as I said, the technology and financial services industry, which has been a pretty big early adopter to technology, some of those industries are doing really well. And of course, you have others that aren't. So we're just going to have to keep our eye on that. And I recommend highly that you check out the Jobcast podcast from about a week or two ago, where I offer some resources and tips on finding your new job. So we're going to take another commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the healthcare industry.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Well, we're going to switch our focus a little bit from jobs to the healthcare industry and how that is faring right now as states are reopening. And, I was going to say, as coronavirus infections are down, and I guess overall in the country they are. However, we know that there's been a big resurgence in several states, in several areas, where they had opened up early and now are kind of feeling it. Nonetheless, the healthcare industry, as most know, has been focused on caring for people with coronavirus, testing, and protecting their workers as well as visitors and the patients themselves. And to that end, most of the hospitals that would treat COVID patients have turned away and discontinued elective procedures and try to avoid any other hospitalizations. And again, anything elective that could be held off or changed. And as a result, that's had quite an impact on the healthcare industry. With revenues being down, that being an area that would keep many hospitals afloat. And, it just wasn't the priority. But now that states have reopened, cases have come down, hospitals are trying to get back to whatever normal is. And it seems that healthcare investors, are counting on the hospitals and healthcare industry to stay at this rate, to stay back in this new mode of bringing patients back. Tenet Healthcare, which operates several dozen hospitals in the United States, had good news for patients and shareholders on its recent call. Admissions to the company's hospitals in the first half of June reached 90% of levels before the coronavirus had hit. Hospital surgery counts reached 95% of pre-crisis levels. So that news is obviously seen as pretty optimistic for the major healthcare institutions like Tenet and also HCA Healthcare, which have hit real lows in terms of their stock prices, and they're hoping that that kind of news will bring it back. But right now, I think they, like a lot of us, are also wondering how that's going to stand up if we do have this second wave or this resurgence of the virus. Or I guess, well, it is a resurgence of the virus in several states where it had initially gone down to the point that they could reopen and now has seen spikes in many of the states. So what this will look like in terms of healthcare trends is still remains to be seen. And COVID-19 cases are rising sharply in highly populated states in the southern and western U.S. Friday, Apple said it was closing 11 stores in Arizona, Florida, and the Carolinas. And that's because, again, of the rise of cases. As a way to cope with the surge in cases, back in March and April, hospitals around the country had shut down elective surgeries to free up bed capacity. Tenet said surgery count fell 55% from a year earlier at the April height. And there's a reason, though, that the healthcare companies feel that this time may be different, even with a resurgence. And that is COVID-19 patients in its hospitals now, many of which are located in the Sunbelt region, are lately skewing younger than in the pandemic's early days. The length of stay on those cases is lower. The resource consumption is lower. And that's according to the COO of Tenet, who gave that observation. Perhaps even more important, shortages of COVID-19 diagnostics and personal protective equipment have been remedied. And you recall early on that was a real issue, was having enough of the PPE. I was almost going to say PPP. That's another COVID term for that we're using, but no, PPE, personal protective equipment. The business of healthcare is in a protracted recovery. A large backlog of patients in need of services has built up over the course of the spring, and filling it is expected to take a good while, even if hospitals take extreme measures. Johnson & Johnson had said in April that it projected elective procedure capacity could expand by 30% nationwide if hospitals and surgery centers operated around the clock. So even absent a formal shutdown, rising case counts and store closures could alter consumer behavior. A patient debating whether to get a knee replacement may choose to wait, for example. So, that, of course, there's the continued question of risk of patients or people out there who may have an underlying major problem and may not be going to get it addressed because of their fear of contracting the virus. We don't know whether we're going to start to see some dire numbers coming out as hospitals begin to start treating those patients now. When they come back, if we're going to find out, many more people contracted other diseases or conditions during this time. Hopefully not. But there's people are weighing their risk between exposure and dealing with something that they're not really sure is a big issue. Hopefully the gamble will pay off and their issues will not be as dire. So we are at a point where we need to take another quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about tech firms going virtual.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So beginning on Monday, June 22nd, Apple is running its Worldwide Developers Conference. This time, however, instead of running it from California, where it would draw thousands and thousands of participants or guests and infuse a lot of money into the local economy and be able to provide networking opportunities and breakout sessions and one-on-one in-person experiences, this time they're doing it virtually. So this is probably the way of the immediate future for the big tech companies and their conferences that usually, as I said, infuse a lot of money into the local economy, but also are a real moneymaker for those companies as well. And, now for reasons we all are aware, they're forced to do them virtually. And because of that, they have to drop, or they don't have to, but wisely, they choose to drop the very expensive fees for going to these conferences. So now they are theoretically open to many more people, and unfortunately also reduce the help to the local economy. Apple has been doing this tech conference for a number of years, and in fact in the 1980s Apple was the one that spawned tech conferences. And they defined the innovation and marketing profile of Silicon Valley. At least the conferences defined the profile of Silicon Valley. And of course, Apple isn't the only one that is doing its conference virtually. Microsoft Corporation's Build conference, Salesforce, the product Salesforce's Dreamforce conference, and Amazon are among some of the others that are also doing their conferences online. About 24 of the conferences are held annually, drawing more than 1 million in-person attendees combined. Tech companies are trying to create worthy virtual versions of events for the software developers, business partners, and customers who power their operations. And they're doing that by broadcasting keynote speeches, providing question and answer sessions, and doing more live video. And 9 weeks before Microsoft's Build conference that it holds for developers, Microsoft had decided to turn the event into an entirely virtual event. The 2-day online gathering, which was held last month, had a larger than expected audience with 193,000 attendees. And that's up about 6,200 from the one they held in person in Seattle last year. By doing that, they didn't try to replicate past events because they knew that watching speakers just talking into the screen was not going to cut it and captivate people. So, first of all, what they did was they waived the $1,500 a person entrance fee, which makes sense because who's going to pay that just to watch something online? But instead they designed the conference so that there would be two hosts that would point viewers towards different sessions that they could attend and private meetings that you could be sent to online. And then they had commentary in between. And so it was kind of a guided sort of conference with these hosts kind of anchoring it. Microsoft said that it was pretty successful, and they expect that they're going to be doing mainly virtual meetings like that going forward. So Salesforce is another one that has a major tech conference every year. They have their Dreamforce conference, which basically takes over San Francisco every year. The event that they had this past November had 171,000 attendees and had a lot of notable speakers, including President Obama, former President Obama. The company has not announced yet what it's going to do for this year's conference, but it has continued to have 50 virtual conferences this year. That's both what they've had already and what they're going to be doing. And so one of the things that was pointed out by someone at Salesforce was that the biggest challenge is recreating authentic networking. And I think that's been the obstacle for a lot of companies planning their conferences going forward, not just tech companies, but any industry type conference, because that is the value of them, is the in-person networking. And it's pretty difficult to replace that. But I think, you've got the top companies, innovative companies in the world looking at that. So hopefully they'll come up with something that will be a good substitute. Or maybe eventually it will go back to in-person meetings, because I'm not sure what you do virtually that could take the place of meeting someone one-on-one and building that connection and potential business partnership. Just lastly, I guess the Apple event was seen as adding a lot of importance because in recent years, the conference was looked as a way to offset the lower iPhone sales, and also because of the rising prices of software and its services. So because the Apple event would draw 6,000 attendees and would bring all of that into the city of San Jose, which would benefit, which, by the way, they get about $9 million in economic activity from that conference. And so, not having it and not charging the approximately $1,600 in admission, it's going to hurt. So hopefully they'll find a way to make up for that, both the company and the city that would have benefited from the live conference. We're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a video game's response to Black Lives Matter and also racial inequality in the fashion industry.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
In recent podcasts, I've talked about what companies are doing and even industries are doing in response to Black Lives Matter and the social injustice issues that have risen to the surface lately because of the George Floyd killing. And many companies are responding in different ways to show their support and to show that they no longer are going to tolerate any type of bias in their companies. And this has come in terms of statements by the CEOs, by having a prominent presence on their websites or other visuals to show that they support Black lives. And also they've been looking at how they're marketing and their products, like some of the popular products, Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, and looking at changing at those brands because they no longer work or send the kind of message that they want, that they feel represents them. So companies have been doing a lot of different things to show their support. And of course, there's a whole other side to that with others, being more scrutinous of the kinds of things that they're doing. Some activists and experts saying it's ornamental or it's, not genuine, some of the things that companies are doing, and that it doesn't affect real change that needs to happen. Nonetheless, I wanted to talk about two entirely different industries and their response to the increased recognition right now. The first is the video game Fortnite, which has removed police cars. This isn't a huge story because the police cars are mainly like ornamental, they're background, they're not something functional anyway in the game. But the fact that they took them out has some feeling that, this was definitely a statement in support of equality and racial injustice in terms of law enforcement. The company is not saying that necessarily. They are saying that they removed it because they're being sensitive about issues that many of its players in our audience are dealing with. Nonetheless, Fortnite, by the way, is one of the most popular games in the world and has more than 350 million players, and that was as of May. The company is based in Cary, North Carolina, and it's valued at $15 billion, at least in 2018. It also owns the app House Party, if you've tried that. So anyway, it's not a big story, but I thought it was just interesting how one company is looking at its product and making changes based on the new awakening or new way of thinking. And I know this is a way that we should have always embraced. Nonetheless, there is, increased attention to it right now, and people are stepping up. Companies are stepping up. So the other story, which is probably a bigger one, is about the fashion industry and how there isn't adequate enough representation of blacks in key roles within the fashion industry. And it was noted in an item that I saw about the disparity between what some of the big design houses are saying they do in support of Black Lives Matter and having equality and diversity within its workforce. The disparity between that, what they're saying, and some of what some consider token efforts, and then putting it into practice in terms of having that fair representation. Some have said that the fashion industry is scrambling to respond to the sweeping social justice movement with donations and social media statements. And fashion labels like Dior and Supreme have posted messages on Instagram in support of Black Lives Matter, and also have put some messages out about racial equality as well. And some companies, as I mentioned, have donated to advocacy organizations like the NAACP and Campaign Zero. But one founder of Fashion for All Foundation, which is a nonprofit that promotes diversity through education, one expert had said, "While I'm happy to see it, it's conflicting because it feels as if it's a one-time notion, and the fight for racial injustice cannot be summed up in a one-time contribution to the NAACP legal fund or by putting up a black square on Instagram." So that's what I was saying before, and I've heard the same kind of sentiment in terms of companies recognizing Juneteenth and putting a lot of emphasis on that. And while some are glad and feel that it's just that they do that, they're hoping that companies go further than that, and it's not just, a token move to do that, to jump on board of the bandwagon, but that there really will mean there will be continued change. Fueling a lot of the outrage is the idea that the industry has capitalized, and this is the fashion industry, has capitalized on Black culture, and that certain fashion trends like streetwear, hoodies and colorful sneakers, that they have been repackaged by design houses to be luxury goods. And despite that, there still aren't enough Black people in terms of fashion, in terms of management and key design roles with those houses. Consumers across racial lines are influenced by fashion worn by celebrities of color like Beyonce, Pharrell Williams, Russell Westbrook, and Offset of the band Migos, one of the number of rappers who regularly sits front row at fashion shows. Fashion magazines frequently put Black stars on their covers, while brands call on them to boost their cool factor. Yet, despite that, there are still few Black professionals in top design house roles. Louis Vuitton menswear and Balmain are the only ones that have Black men to lead design at those labels. In 2019, Rihanna signed a deal with LVMH to start a new luxury label, and that marked the first time a Black woman has led an LVMH brand. Jide Zeitlin of Tapestry, which owns Coach, Kate Spade, and Stuart Weitzman, is one of the few Black CEOs of a major fashion company. So there's a lot more that talks about, what the fashion industry needs to do to move forward and to really make an honest and sincere effort to bring Black talent into the ranks and into key roles there. And so it makes a lot of sense. This is something that was featured in the Wall Street Journal, by the way. So once again, going to take a break. And in our last segment, we're going to talk about the social media platforms and the stance they're taking with Black Lives Matter, and yet how that differs from what their users are reflecting.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And now the final story of our podcast today, and it's about how the various social media platforms and their CEOs have taken a very prominent stand on the Black Lives Matter movement and supporting diversity and justice, social justice. However, those same platforms are also the breeding grounds for those who are against that, and white supremacist groups and others who are taking advantage of the social reach of those platforms. So recently, after the killing of George Floyd, Mark Zuckerberg wrote a long and heartfelt post on his Facebook page where he denounced racial bias and said that Black Lives Matter. He also announced that the company would donate $10 million to racial justice organizations. Twitter did something similar. They changed their official bio to a Black Lives Matter tribute, and their CEO, Jack Dorsey, pledged $3 million to an anti-racism organization, which was started by Colin Kaepernick, the NFL quarterback. YouTube also joined the protests, and its CEO wrote a blog where she said, "We believe Black Lives Matter, and we all need to do more to dismantle systemic racism." YouTube also announced that it started a $100 million fund for Black creators. The problem, of course, is the fact that, social media, which once was used as a tool to help for voices of the oppressed and marginalized, and even to call for protests, is also now being used by racists and others who are trying to undermine the Black Lives Matter movement and other social justice movements. In recent years, a right-wing reactionary movement has now become some of social media's loudest and most established voices on the social media platforms. And those voices often belong to conservative commentators and paid provocateurs whose aim is mocking and subverting social justice movements rather than supporting them. The result is a distorted view of the world that is at odds with actual public sentiment. there is actually a survey that says that a majority of Americans support Black Lives Matter. So obviously, saying that the provocateurs don't necessarily represent the majority. So case in point, on Facebook, on the day that Mark Zuckerberg's post about Black Lives Matter went up, there was an 18-minute video posted by right-wing activist Candace Owens. In the video, Owens, who is black, she railed against protests, calling the idea of racially biased policing a fake narrative, and went on to say other very negative things about George Floyd. The thing is, her video was then shared by right-wing media outlets, and several people on Facebook were told that it was because of Facebook's algorithm that they had seen it, that the algorithm recommended the video to them, and that because of that, collectively, it racked up nearly 100 million views. So it's ironic that Facebook's own algorithm would lead more viewers to this controversial conservative stand. By the way, Candace Owens, who is a serial offender in spreading misinformation and stirring up controversy, she had her Twitter account suspended this year after she encouraged followers to violate stay-at-home orders, and Facebook has applied fact-checking labels to several of her posts. But she does have a very large following, and she continues to get a lot of views. Terrence K. Williams, Ben Shapiro, and the Hodge twins, all of whom have had anti-Black Lives Matter posts go viral over the past several months, are also among the conservative commentators who have large followings. 7 of the 10 most shared Facebook posts containing the phrase Black Lives Matter over the past month were critical of the movement, and that's according to data from CrowdTangle. The sentiment on Instagram, which Facebook owns, has been more favorable, perhaps because its users are younger and typically more liberal. Facebook did not comment on that viral viewing of Owens's post, but it did announce last week $200 million to support Black-owned businesses and organizations. And they added a section on the app to highlight stories from Black people and share educational resources, and the section is called Lift Black Voices. Twitter, which has been a supporter of Black Lives Matter, also has a problem with racists and bigots using its platform. The company discovered that a Twitter account claiming to represent a national Antifa group was actually run by a group of white nationalists posing as left-wing radicals. The account was suspended, but not before its tweets calling for violence were widely shared. Twitter spokesperson said, "We've taken down hundreds of groups under our violent extremist group policy and continue to enforce our policies against hateful conduct every day across the world." YouTube has also struggled with reconciling its corporate values with that of its users and popular views. The most viewed YouTube video about Black Lives Matter got 14 million views, but wasn't really in support of Black Lives Matter. It was actually a video that's 4 years old and was done by someone considered a viral prankster, Joey Saladino. And in the video, he holds up an All Lives Matter sign in a predominantly Black neighborhood. So, unfortunately, there's lots more examples of how how racists and supremacist groups are using social media and getting around some of the screening and some of the rules, like those that Twitter put into place and even Facebook. And I think it's going to be a continuing cat and mouse game to try to catch those. And I think the bottom line is that though something may get many more millions of views for whatever reason, it's not typically reflective of how the majority of Americans feel about Black Lives Matter and the social injustice issues, as has been demonstrated in some of the polls and surveys that have been done. So there's a variety of reasons, of course, why some of these things get views other than what the actual message is and the agreement of the message. There are people that will look for controversial things to say just to get more likes or to get more attention, get more people to look at their video, despite even what their own personal beliefs might be. So it's an unfortunate situation. I feel social media is a great tool to use, and it certainly has, I think, been a great resource during the shutdown. It has enabled friendships and relationships and people to express themselves during a time when they weren't able to meet in person. However, this is, of course, the downside of it, when people can use it for bad, for evil. Well, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. I want to thank you for joining us for the GSMC Business News Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. And as always, please go to wherever it is that you subscribe to podcasts and subscribe to this so you can get this each and every time it comes out. And also, please consider leaving us comments or feedback on one of our social media channels, or all of them for that matter, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks again for joining me. Take care.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.